Summarize some of the key points of their discussion and takeaway messages, and then we'll have brief, sort of Q&A after each one, just to kind of flesh out and make sure we get a sense of what people are thinking and proposing, and then we'll go into the general discussion that Peter will lead after that. So as soon as Teresa has my group, which was the long-running group, group 2 loaded, we can open it up, and or do you want to just open up one right now? Yeah. So Doug, you're ready to go? Okay.
Okay, so this is broad brush outline. We didn't spend any time on wordsmithing or anything like that. Obviously, we're not writing the document, but just trying to organize some what we felt were key points that should be in this white paper. First point we felt was essential to make was why the Arctic matters, and emphasizing that changes in the Arctic are of both regional and global importance. So therefore, the changes in the Arctic have collective impact on billions of people, in addition to the impact on the lives of the people who actually live and work in the Arctic. We considered, and this is obviously for the people writing the document, whether it's appropriate to mention the relevance of Arctic change in the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think that's up for the writers in the US. Certainly in Canada, we would certainly have included that. It's not just climate change, however, that is the issue. There are major socioeconomic and cultural issues involved with the changes ongoing in the Arctic, impacting industries such as transportation, mineral resource industry, ecosystem changes which impact biodiversity, acidification likewise, SLR, Jessica? Sea level rise, sorry, and global weather patterns. So. And some of these are local and regional, and some of them clearly are global. We know there's change. The important emphasis is we know there is change, we know there is change ongoing, and we know there is risk of runaway change. And therefore, we also know that the situation in the Arctic is urgent, and that the timescale for opportunity to address the changes, and if we want, to slow them down or potentially reverse them, the window of opportunity is narrow and imminent. Okay, next one. Oh, sorry, yeah. So what do we do? So we know it's, so the key thing for this white paper is that we need to expand the scientific approach from what we're presently doing. We need to broaden our research activities into the solution space. Now I'll leave the writers to figure out what that really means. The urgent research needs, including observations and understanding of ongoing changes, include issues like sea ice thickness, subsurface temperatures in the Arctic Ocean, glacial melting, of course, biodiversity changes, both on land and in the sea. But also we need much better understanding of these teleconnections, which are the impact of the Arctic on the broader Earth system, obviously including sea level, CO2 emissions, whether from permafrost or from changing CO2 sink. And I think important to mention are the nutrient exports, because they are large and significant, at least for the Atlantic Ocean. In all of this, in our expansion of our scientific effort, we have to involve participatory collaboration with northern peoples, especially with the indigenous communities. This needs to become central to our science, and it will deliver mutual benefits. And so that hopefully will be emphasized really strongly, that this is not a place where we just do science in the absence of interactions with people. In the next year, so what do we do? In this year, we propose that we should address the question of this question that was raised: what is the Arctic that we want to have, and how do we get it? And a concrete suggestion is that we address this question next year in Ottawa, Canada. And we'll leave it up to Obama and Justin Trudeau to figure out who organizes that and who pays for it. So we have a question, and we'll get the Canadians or the Americans to pay for it. All right. So what do we do continued? So that would have to be addressed, obviously, internationally in some way. What do we do continued? Well, what do we implement? In addition to that still urgent but longer range looking question, in parallel, we need to start implementing now approaches to responding, mitigating, adapting to Arctic change. And specific examples that could be implemented now include decreasing black carbon emissions, for example, from shipping, implementation of renewable energy rapidly in the Arctic, and then on the socio-economic sides of things, addressing some of these governance issues that were raised, especially concerning adaptation to the change which is already ongoing. For example, the issue of relocating communities if and when necessary. How do we do that? We need to increase our observation system to a level which is at least the level of other regions, found in other regions of the Earth. But in addition, we have to build into the observing system early warning capacity to detect any evidence for surprises, as well as convert the observing system so it performs not only defining the current state, but allows us to assess how well we are doing with our solutions, in order that we can verify models, but also the effectiveness of the solutions that we're progressively implementing. And a point is made that satellites aren't enough for this. We really need measurements on the ground. And in the context of this enhanced scientific activity and solutions-oriented research ongoing in the Arctic, in addition to building in participation of northern peoples, this needs to be designed in order to build in opportunities to build the capacity for Arctic residents and students to both participate in the science, but also impact the education process in the North. So that needs to be an integral part of the scientific attention focused on the region. And I think that's it, right, Jessica? That was the last one? Yep.
Great, thank you very much, Group 1. Does anybody have questions or comments? We've got Brendan, Charlie.
So I know you didn't want to spell out what moving research into the solution space was, but maybe somebody could give me some examples that are specific to the Arctic.
Okay, so yeah, that's jargony. We have to spell out specifics. Does somebody in the group want to give an example of how we do that? Okay.
Well, one example would be related to the decay of infrastructure, not just looking at what we see, and we had very graphic images yesterday in Robin's presentation, but also figuring out what are you doing if you are can you repair it? If you would have to reroute it, where would you reroute it? What is the situation in these new pathways for that? Should you relocate? If so, where to? How safe is the new location with respect to future changes? So this would all be research that would support options for solutions.
Another example might be obviously fishery management and energy supply.
So Charlie and then Anders.
I was just going to mention at the beginning of your report, you said why you were going to have something to the effect of why the Arctic matters. The U.S. Arctic Research Commission developed a small little piece, outreach piece, that handles that very issue, and you might want to consult that to get a bunch of ideas on what the key points to emphasize might be.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, we recognize that, quite a few of these things have been explained, and that point probably was meant to be made quite short as an introduction, but it's a good point to look at that specifically.
Just a short, on the runaway effects, I would be careful, or I just don't know what this means at the moment, but runaway always triggers something, and perhaps we don't want to call it like that.
Good. Any other questions? Yes, Rafe.
If Brendan's question was, what were examples to which piece of the, was it the policy, was it adaptation, emissions, or I wasn't clear which aspect.
No, I was reacting to the statement that research needs to move into the solution space, and I was asking for an Arctic example, and Peter gave me some.
On Arctic, because we did discuss, the need for investment across the board in the pieces closer. Damn. After 2 days, I haven't learned. Closer. The R&D effort that's required in the decarbonization, the carbon removal, and understanding solar radiation management. Those are research needs in the context of arriving at a state that's a tolerable end. Those are important elements. But that's what I thought you might have meant, but I'm not sure.
No, I was wanting to know what you guys meant in that, and the examples you just gave, I would argue, are not Arctic specific, and that's
No, they're
fine.
not. No. Right.
Peter gave us some Arctic
They relate to achieving the Arctic state.
There's one other point, though, with the word expand into as opposed to shift, because we are very conscious of the Australian model where, with the acknowledgement of climate change and the need for solutions, the Australian government appeared to have decided that there was no need to do any climate change research anymore. And of course, in a situation, in a system so nonlinear and complex as the Arctic, that wouldn't be a particularly smart move to shift to solutions and give up on all the other science. So we see expand into the solution space, but not just kind of leave one type of science and do something completely different.
Okay, great. Let's thank Group 1 for their wonderful... All right, go Group 1. Okay, now it's time for Group 2. Well, thank you. Group 2 definitely had a vigorous discussion, so I really was enriched by that experience. So here we go. First, we thought it was worthwhile to just state right up front what everyone often passes by, but we thought maybe putting forth the priorities, of course restating that emissions reductions and adaptation have to happen at the same time and are the first priority of global efforts. And then removing carbon out of the atmosphere should be investigated and deployed when it's economically feasible. There was discussion yesterday about that. And also conduct research on solar radiation management to understand all of its dangers and opportunities so that we're not running forward blind. So we thought there was rich literature. There's no lack of scientific information on the physical side, biochemical side, biophysical side on the Arctic science. However, we do think that there is a need for science in the distinguishing between the 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. We think there's a lot of room for advancement in that area because we have to paint a picture for the Paris Agreement that everyone signed on to. What do we get in that world? And I think that we've been, that there still is in this complex world, as Doug had mentioned. We don't want to just go the Australia model and stop doing our science research. But in that science, we absolutely have to advance the social science and the co-development of knowledge and governance issues. So this bottom part is just a recognition of the Arctic Matters outreach report. There's so many nice summaries of this, so we could point to those references and not dwell on our cover letter in the briefing report. Refer to many stuff that's gone before. But we do have to recognize and probably raise that there's an important impediment to our creative ability to really prioritize. This is a resource-constrained world. Where are we going to put our resources as a globe? So
The Arctic Council and the observer nations are important in this effort and have access to funding for community co-production of knowledge, as well as improving and creating self-governance for communities that are on the front lines of climate change and can really help solve in some of the solutions, as well as co-generation of critical scientific and observing information. So we also need to, as I mentioned, advance governance to rise to this grand challenge. And as our governance societies, there are different formats around the world, and including observer nations, many have developed in a, quote, stable climate of human civilization evolving to our current state of governance. So we need to change some of the barriers. For example, in the United States, people pointed out in our group that indigenous knowledge is not currently required for co-development of knowledge. And so, typo there, co-development of knowledge. And essentially in Canada, for example, it's required, we learned. So there are, using the word we may consult the local community can change it to must. These words really matter, and we can improve that. Also, a SAON-like institution to coordinate international science and social science observing once we establish these priorities. And the prioritization really have to be globally relevant. Which Arctic measures and monitoring does the globe really need? And therefore, more funding theoretically would be available because the globe would really, the governance would really care about these particular observing networks. And again, we keep coming back to sustained funding would be smarter planning for the future. And I guess we ran out of time and I had to put it up. So I open it up to the group to add to some of the priorities that there were. It was a rich discussion, so if there are any other group members who would like to add before we take questions.
Does anybody else want to add something? No? Okay, so let's go ahead. Any questions from the rest about the points that were raised here? Yes, Mary Beth, and then Peter.
Can you just elaborate on the bit about SAON-like organization with respect to coordinating science and social science observing?
Yeah, I think the idea there was that, it's more useful, we thought, for the science ministers to have us point to what's needed, what kind of coordination effort was needed, rather than call out a specific entity. But something like what SAON does is the sort of thing, and whether it's SAON or has a different name is less important to us. But that function, in other words, rather than leave it to science ministerials at odd intervals to sort of push observing, we need it needs to be guided and stewarded in the long run.
Peter?
I had the same question, and I mean, maybe one way to phrase that is that, there should be support for coordination on the international level of observing in, the physical and social domains, whatever, so that this becomes clearer what is really meant. But I had another question that is, with respect to priorities, you seem to have made a big point in your group about that. In a sense, of course, we are all aware that prioritization has to happen, but what are you asking or what are you suggesting to the science ministerial, that they put the priorities on, or that they put a mechanism up for prioritization, which in my view is intrinsic in any kind of science process? It is somewhat dangerous to, if that is not formulated correctly, then you in essence give the mandate away to prioritize, and I think that that's something that is best done on the scientific side.
Sure.
So I just would be careful with this one.
Right, just typical, I mean, we've seen all the scientific priorities. It's a laundry list of a lot of things to do, and there was the sense that policymakers and those who are approving the funding and making these things possible often are overwhelmed by the list of all these things that scientists want to do, and can we be more effective? And also there was a kind of a comment in our group sort of mentioning, well, if I was living in the Solomon Islands, what type of Arctic indicator would be most relevant to me? It might go beyond just polar scientists or groups. And so if it becomes much more useful to global society, what is spent to within that, of course, the scientific community would be hugely part of the process of designing these. I mean, I think there's already good thinking already about how to do that, but the non-sustained funding often becomes an issue to have really smart prioritization and sequencing of the science that is done, and social science and governance issues and many other aspects of this huge problem. So we thought it hasn't been working as well in the past. Can we improve upon this and have the Arctic Council encourage a meeting where different stakeholders, but mostly scientists and social scientists, get together and figure out what priorities would be really helpful for this large indicator. Ed, you wanted to add to that?
You know, I think you covered it pretty well, but I think the record shows that we've failed miserably as a science community to really come up with priorities that even come close to matching resources. So some way, some mechanism, and I take your point, Peter, that you wouldn't just want the ministers to have a nice weekend and come out and say, these are the priorities. We've written lots and lots and lots about this, but what we haven't done is figured out any way to match it to, in fact, the resources for sustaining observations in the long term. Somehow, we need some help from the higher levels of the science ministries to go that important step of matching the sustainable, the observations that need to be sustained with how would you pay for that? Who's going to do it?
Any other questions or comments for Group 2? No? Okay, let's thank Group 2. All right. And we'll move on to Group 3.
Talk for a bit first. I have to use my cheat notes. So I have some slides that I'm going to show just at the end. Right, so we kind of started off in our group talking about the different points that Peter had up on the screen, and we talked initially first about adaptation and the different scales of adaptation and how you might get that into a document that would go to a ministerial meeting, recognizing that local adaptation has certain requirements, and regional and national and global, and that it needs to be discussed at all levels, but it's really at the ministerial level that the global adaptation can be addressed. There's not really any other way we can do that as a community. So that was an important point. I'm going to do some general overview and then get into some more specifics. Then we talked about whether we all agreed that our ultimate goal was to bring the carbon down so that we could change the current trajectory of the system and stabilize it to a point where emissions might no longer be driving the system. But recognizing that we're on the trajectory for the next quarter century, we need to have innovation and adaptation, and this has to cover everything from social adaptation to infrastructure and those kinds of things. The next thing we talked about was the recognition amongst our group that data sharing and open access to data is necessary, not just for understanding the observations that are coming out, but actually for developing adaptation and mitigation strategies. You can talk about it all you want, but if you don't have free and easy access to data, you can't really get anywhere. And then we had quite a bit of a discussion about money, because it always comes down to money in the end. And we came to the conclusion that what the ideal situation would be to have some kind of an international fund, a fund that's blind to borders, with perhaps even a special segment of that fund set aside for research that specifically addressed local needs, but that also was resourced to develop a truly international observing system. And we talked a bit about what that might cost and how that could be resourced. And it was suggested that one way to resource it is to tap into the many countries, of which there are, I believe, 50, that participate in the Arctic Circle, not just the Arctic nations and the observer countries, but actually the much broader spectrum of countries that have expressed strong interest in the Arctic. And then we kind of talked about the priorities, what we sort of research priorities, which would include the development of the observing system and its implementation, the research around appropriate mechanisms for data sharing, research around carbon cleanup and sequestration, and implementation. Adaptation research, which would include things like food and water related issues, health and well-being, and the research that needs to be done around how to implement solutions. So you can come up with a carbon scrubber, but how are you actually going to implement that and get it out there? And that sort of speaks back to the framework issues around things and policy issues around governance and decision making. Getting down into some of the more specifics, we decided that it is important to try and get nations to commit to an international Apollo scale type program, and that should have real operational commitments. How that's articulated in a document like this, I'm not sure. But this would enable research on critical Arctic climate system components like permafrost, the Greenland ice sheet and the other ice sheets, ecosystem health, marine and terrestrial ecosystems, the science of adaptation, the science of mitigation, and that there have to be social science priorities included, and those are the things I just mentioned, like health, well-being, health of communities, governance. It's true that we need big science, but we have to, in this document, somehow articulate that the science that addresses the global issues also needs to be scaled down to the local. Finally, we talked about the STEM and education, and that the school-based programs have lots of plus and minuses, and there should be some way we can articulate in this document about how outreach must go beyond that. It needs to go to the broader public along the lines of the work that Stephanie's been doing. And there was some also discussion about looking at the Arctic footprint of commercial and industrial activities and establishing a method for reporting on that, and actually maybe using that as a way to leverage resources for doing the kind of science we want to do. So then from there, and now I just have a couple of slides that we made thinking about how you might organize some of the things that we talked about, because it was a pretty broad-ranging discussion. So in thinking about the science priorities and how you might articulate those in a sort of a simple way, and I would ask David to call on David if I mess this up, because I'm definitely not at the top of my game. What are the different parameters we'd be interested in looking at through the Arctic observing system? Permafrost, sea level rise, land ice, sea ice, snow cover, et cetera. What's the trend? And this is something that as experts in the room, we're all able to populate. What is the permafrost trend? Is there a tipping point at which there's no recovery, or what would happen? If yes, when might that be? Or is it irreversible even if we get to negative emissions or engage in solar radiation management? And what are the impacts? So this is kind of a way to organize our thoughts around the different science and the things that would need to be done. And from that table, from that table, you could actually put these things into different categories of low risk, long timeline, high risk, short timeline, and that would help to establish priorities for, let's do this first with respect to observing, let's do this next, and that would be something that's a fairly simple diagram that policymakers could understand. Not that they don't understand complicated things for anybody who might be a policymaker. And then we talked a little bit about solutions, and again, the commitment that we have to fund this, and it has to be sustainable funding, and it has to come from diverse sources. And somehow there needs to be some kind of international consensus on how we're going to do this. So I'll leave it there, and I will send the notes. Any questions?
Thanks. Questions for group 3? Brenda?
I really like, could you go back to that graph? I really like that prioritization, since we were having, ways to organize prioritization would be a good, this looks really important. I was wondering, how do you, the one divided by time, the issue when you have something that may take centuries, but it's disintegrating, the Greenland ice sheet, once you pass a certain threshold, is that like 1 over the time that you reach that threshold of below average temperature, and then you've reached the disintegration, the high impact, and that's how you get it? Or
So I'm going to
even if the
refer
impact
you.
is longer? Yeah.
I'm going to refer you to the graph designer.
Okay, thanks. The way I thought of this, and again, that's, it's here for peer review and throw rocks at me. I've been an operational weather forecaster for 35 years. There's nothing somebody can say in here that's going to hurt me. But what I was thinking, let's say for sea level rises, even though it may take centuries or millennia to realize the full thing, once you have something going that you can't recover from, I would call that the time. And this is like a graph you could use. It'd be a perfect graph in a business school. I'm sure Columbia has one, because there's no numbers on either X or Y axes there. But the idea is, high urgency would be short time, and lower urgency would be somewhere on the left. Maybe on the right-hand side, that's really years to decades. Maybe we have a decade or so. Maybe on the left-hand side, maybe that's multiple decades to, maybe it's not the top issue in the 21st century, but it's still something we could look at. That's totally up for, people would say, no, that's crazy, we should have a different time scale or whatever. And I just somehow wanted, because everybody looks at these kinds of graphs and you want sort of the highest risk or the highest whatever. If it's up at the top right, I just find it's easier for people to look at, which is why I have that kind of funky urgency scale on the x-axis there.
And research shows that that's where people look first, is the top right. So
You see, I remember all the cred stuff that you
got it
guys
right.
used to do. Yeah.
So Mikhail and then Anders.
Yeah, just with respect to this urgency timescale, I think necessarily the high urgency is defined by time in terms of when action is needed. So it doesn't matter whether the disintegration of say, an ice sheet takes place in 100 years, but if the action has to be taken now to prevent this, the urgency is there to do it on a short time scale.
Anders?
I agree with both, and I think actually that, especially for the Arctic and Greenland, sea level would be simply on the high impact but very low urgency level, simply because we can reverse the temperature, we can reduce the temperature, and it stops. So it's just how it is. That's why it's so helpful to have a diagram like this, because it shows that sea level, even though everyone makes a big fuss about it, is not so urgent.
Okay, I thought we had heard that we were locking in for every degree, we were locking in meters of sea level rise.
Exactly, but it's not urgent. So this will unfold over a long period of time. And you're right, with respect to Antarctica, that you might actually tip something that you really cannot undo anymore, but with respect to Greenland, you can undo it.
Yeah, Robin?
Yeah, so I disagree in regard to the urgency. Can you please use the mic? I disagree in regard to the urgency, because if you're talking about small island developing states, we're talking about now. And in regard to sea level rise, right, there are these high risk impacts that are happening now, and we're talking about numbers of people. So anyway, I just challenge you in regard to the impact of sea level rise and whether or not it's like an urgent risk or not.
Yeah, Brendan is next, and then Anders, you can respond.
So this is exactly the way this discussion about prioritization goes over and over again, right? So we could spend the next 3 days trying to come to some consensus here. We wouldn't make it, by the way. So the plea I'm making is we need to figure this out. And what I mean by figure this out is not what the priorities are, but how do you determine them in an international context that's trying to figure out what observations to sustain. And as long as we can't figure that out, all of our cleverness of knowing what we can observe and how we can observe it doesn't serve us very well.
Yeah, okay, there we go. I think the measure of impact, whether you're talking about number of people impacted, dollars lost, loss of biodiversity, there's so many different measures for impact. And, I think it's a good scale, but from a policy perspective, how do you pit those against each other and put all of these different factors onto the same graph? That would be the question that I would have with something like this. I think it's good, but then determining how you measure impact is going to be dependent on your audience. It's going to be dependent on a lot of different factors.
Okay, so I think taking Brendan's point, are there any other questions about Group 3's suggestions? No? Okay, so let's thank Group 3. And then we'll turn this back over to Peter to take us through the next steps. Wrap things up. Yep.
Okay, we are almost done. And it was interesting to see what we got back from the working groups. Apparently, there was quite a bit of discussion in two of the groups about prioritization, where there was virtually none in the third group. And I think, I would like to challenge some of the statements that have been made about scientists being completely incapable of putting priorities on something. There are examples out there where, if the question is well defined, priorities, at least in categories, have been assigned in the past and have been followed and have worked. They usually broke down when the funding system sort of collapsed to a degree where even the fundamental actions that were recommended could not be supported anymore. But what we do have to figure out is what are our top themes that we want to address. And there might be the real challenge in terms of prioritization, rather than what we typically do, which is prioritizing at a lower level, sort of competing against each other with parameter X versus Y and how to measure this and which instrument to use. So apparently this is a big one, but we have to be, I think when we are drafting the report, we have to be extremely careful how we frame that, because that could, just from my experience with many big programs that had to do hard priorities, priority assignments, it can help if it's done well, but it also can completely backfire. And especially when you cross and sort of communicate between the scientific and the political domains, and that is not that well tested. So we have seen many accidents there. So we will make sure that this priority issue or prioritization issue is taken up, and that we can figure out a way to bring that into the into the statement in a fashion that I think it was meant to be, but try to avoid the pitfalls that are clearly in there. So overall, I try to sort of, when the presentations went by, I try to see where are the commonalities, where do we seem to have a line of a story that can be built from the pieces. And I think I'm now going beyond the reports from the three groups, sort of just taking what I have heard during the 2 days. It seems to be important to go into the report with some very strong statements to set the stage that do include this change is a reality, and that can be very short statements, and we can point to literature that has been written on that. And we have also templates from IPCC how to phrase that, how to phrase we know, in terms of there is unequivocal evidence, there is high likelihood, etc. So, but some statement that is very strong in terms of this is going on, I think should be right at the beginning. And of course, the urgency is something that you can't do. It has been said many times, but you just cannot help putting that back in right after that statement that it's really happening, and that probably we can be as strong as saying this is happening faster than we were able in the past to react to and to respond to, and that this is the time really to start to catch up, because otherwise the gap between what is playing out and what we are doing in terms of understanding and responding to it is widening. Then I think, again, setting the stage, and again, this can be very short, but I think is extremely important, is a statement about how wide the impact is, including that those, of course, who are living in the Arctic are experiencing the change immediately and are living through hardships because of that right now and during the past decade plus. But that beyond that immediate impact, there is also a global footprint of that change that reaches billions of people in different ways. And we can highlight that with just snippets, such as sea level rise and others, where we don't have to put a lot of words down, still get a strong message across. Further message in that build-up, I think that is important, is to make the point that we are not just talking about climate. This is not Arctic IPCC. There are many more dimensions to that change that are coming from different causes. And whereas it's recognized and everybody understands that climate as a driver is a big one, there are other elements, so we really should make that clear right at the outset. Then, in different ways, I think that the three groups did hint at the fact, and that I think could be crafted in a nice statement, that we have to expand our research domain. That whereas we have to continue our efforts to better understand the system in its basic functioning, we also have to understand how we actually make suggestions for options to solutions to some of the problems that are very obvious, such as some of the ones that have been presented here. And that sort of also holds for the observing system. And all of these, of course, are points that are in these 4 bullets of the Science Arctic Science Ministerial. The observing system that we have right now originally was actually driven from considerations that were really out there to observe the physical system. And slowly but steadily we learned that this is not enough, that it has to be a hybrid system, both in terms of design and in terms of utility. And I think by adding some components and saying we have to expand the purpose of the system and the features of the system into, for example, early warning components and into elements that are directly usable for verification and validation of models and of the outcome of measures that are implemented, it keeps the pressure on enhancing the observing system, but not just as it is right now, but this is something that's emerging and has features that are much more applied and much more relevant for a broader spectrum of stakeholders. I'm not sure how much that came out in the other 2 working groups. I don't think I heard it in the reports back, but I cannot imagine that it didn't come up, and that is what we have in front of us cannot be done on a small scale. It needs a full international participation with strong national contributions, because simply the tasks, we know that, and we sort of always bring that up in the context of the observing system, but I think it also holds for the other scientific components, for synthesis of certain features and feedback into the observing system and vice versa. I think that's a point that has to be made strongly, and I think that's a platform that should be able to deal with that and handle it. What I did see come out, which is something that we had discussed throughout the meeting, is that we have to find examples to highlight what we mean, that are really graphic, easy to describe, but clearly applicable and sort of bringing the messages across. And then that was mainly something that came up in Working Group 1, but I think sort of was, you could see that it was present in much of the meeting, and that is the question of which Arctic state are we aiming to achieve. And that's why that meeting was placed into Group 1, to say this should be the start of a process that really brings the minds together in figuring out what is it actually that we are looking for. And that is a dialogue that needs to include a lot of stakeholders, primarily people who are living there, but people who are affected by the consequences of change, which they actually imposed from low latitude. So we are getting, something back that we had triggered without anticipating the consequences. But also the, decision makers have to be at the table when this is done. And so, while we are continuing to expand our work on observing, understanding, putting some solutions, expanding the scientific and observing domains, this discussion, I think, is overdue and probably has to happen in a very short order, because otherwise we are sort of shooting in too wide a range and thereby diffusing our resources without getting the impact that we have. And so that is something that has to be vetted, of course, with the core writing group, with the group as a whole. But I sense that this was in the background of our discussion, sometimes actually in the foreground throughout the meeting, and then it came out very clearly in the discussion in Group 1. So this is my first read of what we have seen here. And we can have some discussion about these points in a moment. Just before that gets lost, as many of you asked, how is the process moving forward from here, and what is the time frame? The time frame is short. We have a few weeks to put that briefing paper together. It is probably 4 to 5 pages at most, so it has to be digestible. At the same time, it has to be concise. So we have quite a bit of material. Some of it is starting to actually, look right in a way, in terms of the messaging, in terms of the clarity, in terms of the shortness in which it can be captured. Others is still a little bit cloudy, a little bit diffuse, and has to sort of go through another 1, 2, 3 rounds of thinking about it. And then when you start to integrate, the picture becomes sometimes first more cloudy, but then hopefully more clear. So the way we intend to do that is to put together a writing group that at the beginning will consist of the organizing committee members and the co-sponsors, representative of the co-sponsors, and that will be about 7, 8 people. So broad enough, diverse enough so that it should be able to come up with a good draft. That will be shared with the group for comment, for edits, for suggestions. And then the intent is that whoever would like to and feels comfortable to sign on to that document that will emerge and will be the final, that will be channeled into the Science Ministerial, will be listed. And the intent here clearly is to acknowledge how the process really took place, but to also show the kind of diversity of the group, because this is not just a group of scientists. And it's not just a group of US scientists, although we are a little bit heavy on that side, but it is a relatively diverse group. And one thing that I actually just sort of thinking about the diversity of the group that I wanted to mention that I forgot in summarizing the points that were highlighted is that global intervention piece by having some impact on modulating or regulating the global greenhouse gases through either CDR or a combination of CDR and SRM, because Group 2 did call out experiments on SRM, so we will look at that. But so that is how we envision this process to occur, and so Stephanie.
Just add one point to that, which is, we've mentioned a couple times that the call to action, people said that the best is to get information by the end of July, and that's next week, right? And clearly this process of putting together the document is taking longer than that. So we'll be filing some key ideas by the end of July. So we just have to talk about how to handle that. But any of you who want to file an idea, on the website, just go White House, Arctic Science Minister, call to action. I don't think that there's a requirement that it be U.S. based. I don't remember seeing that in the call. And don't be put off by the fact that it says that the ideas have to be something that is already happening and doesn't need funding, or it has some funny language like that. But I think just, the more people that are kind of writing in with ideas, the better. So we just encourage you to go ahead and go and file some of the ideas that you have as well, because the time frame is so short.
Yeah. Right, but through the placeholder that we are putting in, we actually have, in essence, quote unquote, bought some time to get the final document in, after a few weeks. So the fact that it says this closes by the end of July does not prevent us, the way we have set up our process, from producing the briefing paper and getting it in. We are actually in touch through Stephanie and Rafe and possibly others with the organizers of the ministerial. So finally, because Stephanie did, and it came up in Group 3, the funding issue. Clearly, in the end, one of the major goals of putting that together is to increase the resource base. And so we have to make a strong case why that is needed, and hopefully that group reacts to this and other input that they will get in a way that over a period that's rather short, because as we said, the problems are really urgent, will lead to some increase in the resources available for implementing some of the suggestions that will come out of the full process beyond our own. So that's in essence what we have in mind, and I would like to open the floor now for your thoughts on what you have seen from the working groups, from the workshop as a whole, what you heard about timelines, process, and things like that. So Anders?
I just wonder, whenever I start writing a paper, I put the title first. Do you have a title?
We don't have the title yet, no. That is something that different people are doing it different ways. Some people start with the title, others start with the content. But if you have a good idea for a title, please relate it. Other questions, comments? Rafe.
Up close. Yay. I want to endorse my own idea. I wanted to just discuss a little bit more the importance of establishing a next step in this process. And this is the idea of Ottawa 2017. What's the Arctic we have to have, or where do we have to get to? Because if we can put in place, if Prime Minister Trudeau would come forward and invite the Science Ministerial to Ottawa in a year with an idea of what the topic will be, then everything that gets done at this ministerial continues to live in terms of a global process. So I'm recalling if in my days at the State Department, we went to Berlin to the first conference of the parties. And the Japanese delegation stood up and said, we offer Kyoto in 3 years to agree to the Kyoto, what would become the Kyoto Protocol. And that move, just set in motion, having a place and a time sets in motion a process. So I know our Canadian delegation here has convened themselves. They're ready to act. So I wish them well. No pressure.
So thanks, Rafe. We actually, the way I recall our discussion was that Ottawa is mentioned as one option, but we were not so sure if we are, if we want to write that in. Rather, there was another idea to say we need a Rafe Pomerantz meeting 1 year from now in whichever capital will pick it up. So no, just joking. If we call out Canada and Ottawa for that meeting is still something that we have to discuss, but clearly that kind of meeting, we felt strongly in Group 1 that this is something that could bring that discussion about what is the target we are actually shooting for, that this discussion has to be held. Any other comments? Oh. 5 o'clock even. I think everybody is ready to quit. So let me thank everybody who contributed to the discussions, who came. Some of you I know came very long ways, and for all the contributions, presentations, leading the working groups. I think for myself it was a great meeting. A lot of stimulation on a broad level. I personally feel we should have more of those in addition to our sort of very specialized meetings where we drive the specific science forward. I actually expect that we will come out with a good product, but we need all your input. And so you should hear from us within, let's say, a week or 10 days, with some first draft of that briefing paper. Before closing, I would like to especially thank Teresa, who escaped. Oh, there she is. As most of you have realized during the process, we would not function without her input and guidance here. And also you saw Pamela sit out there and sort of keeping an eye over the logistics, the food, the drinks, making sure that we are not overheating and not being overcooled by the air conditioners here. So I'm not sure if she's still there, but if not, I will make sure that she will hear that in person. And then, of course, all those who have helped to finance, sponsor, and co-sponsor the workshop, because it's always, a precondition for having these kind of platforms to exchange. So I guess that will get us to the end. And safe travels to everybody, and you will hear from us shortly. Thank you.
And thank you to Peter Schlosser, Stephanie Furman, Brad Eck, Margaret Williams, and Rafe Pomerantz in the organizing committee.